I woke up on my 67th birthday to the smell of coffee my son-in-law made, just strong enough to seem thoughtful, and by that evening my own son would stand in his backyard and hand me a folded piece of paper that would tell me my time in his house was over. He didn't know that 4 months earlier, a lawyer in Baton Rouge had called to tell me my estranged sister, Loretta, had died and left me every share of the trucking company our father built from a single flatbed in 1961. $41 million, give or take, sitting quiet in a trust with my name on it while I kept sleeping on a pull-out couch in my son's garage apartment and handing him $300 every month like a man grateful just to be tolerated. My name is Harold Bricknell. I'm 67 years old, and for 40 years I drove long-haul freight up and down I-35 between Duluth and Dallas, missing more birthdays and school plays than I ever got to attend, and telling myself the whole time that the miles were worth it because they put food on the table. This is the story of what happened after my son handed me that folded piece of paper, and what I quietly decided to do about it 3 weeks later that nobody in that family saw coming. I should back up, because none of this makes sense without knowing how I ended up in that garage apartment in the first place. My wife Diane died 2 winters ago, congestive heart failure, the kind that takes its time and then doesn't. After the funeral, the house we'd owned in Wichita for 31 years felt like a museum nobody visited. I'd walk past a reading chair by the window most mornings and just stand there, the way grief makes you stand in doorways for no reason at all. My son Dennis lived across town with his wife Priscilla and their boy Cole, who was 11, and their girl, Ruth Ann, who was 7. Dennis called me most Sundays that first year, and around the time the second winter was coming on, he told me the house was too much for one man to keep up, that the roof needed work I couldn't do myself anymore, that family looks after family, and that I should sell up and come stay with them until I got my feet under me again. I wanted to believe him, the way a lonely man wants to believe almost anything that sounds like being wanted. So I sold the house on Kellogg Avenue that October. It brought a fair price, and I put $160,000 of it straight into helping Dennis and Priscilla refinance and expand the house they had. Adding a mother-in-law suite over the garage that Dennis said was, for me, permanent, no strings, family taking care of family. My old army buddy, Frank Delacroix, who'd gone on to become a real estate attorney after the service, drew up a simple note for the money anyway, the way Diane always said to do things properly, even between people who loved each other. I moved into that garage apartment with a recliner, a card table, and a few of my tools hung on a pegboard, so it would feel like mine. Paid Dennis and Priscilla $300 a month toward the electric and the groceries, and drove Cole and Ruth Ann to school most mornings, since Priscilla worked the early shift at the hospital billing office. I never asked for anything beyond a seat at that dinner table. I even repainted the whole garage apartment myself that first spring, patched the drywall, put down new flooring, all out of my own pocket. Because if I was going to live under someone else's roof, I wanted it to look like I'd earned my place there, instead of just occupying a spare room. The first year was decent, not the life Diane and I had planned, but decent. The second year, something started shifting in ways nobody said out loud. Dennis would mention at the dinner table, half joking, that the water heater was working overtime since I'd moved in, like I was running 40-minute showers instead of the quick ones. I actually took most mornings out of habit from decades on the road. Priscilla was tired most evenings from the hospital, and she'd come in, kick off her shoes, and go straight to the bedroom instead of sitting with us the way she used to when Diane was still alive, and used to call Priscilla just to talk about nothing in particular. The grandkids were the one part of that house that never changed toward me. Ruth Ann would come down to the garage apartment most nights, in her socked feet, and tell me everything that happened at recess, whether I'd asked her to or not. Cole, buried in his phone most of the time, like most boys his age, still came to me when his math homework got past what he could manage alone, because I'd always been better with numbers than either of his parents, and he'd sit at my card table until it clicked for him. But between Dennis and Priscilla, something started happening that I couldn't quite put a name to at first. Conversations would stop when I came up from the garage for a glass of water. Voices dropped low in the kitchen, some evenings. I told myself I was imagining it, that a widower alone too long starts seeing shapes and shadows that aren't really there. I kept driving the kids to school. I kept handing over my $300 the first of every month. I told myself that was enough to keep my place at that table. Then, on a Thursday afternoon in the spring, while I was folding laundry down in the garage apartment, my phone rang with a Louisiana number I didn't recognize. The man on the line introduced himself as Thomas Ledoux, an attorney out of Baton Rouge, And he told me my sister Loretta had passed away the week before from a stroke, alone in her house outside town, found 2 days later by a neighbor who noticed her mail piling up. I sat down hard on the edge of my recliner. When he told me that part, Loretta and I hadn't spoken in almost 20 years. We'd fallen out badly over how to handle our father's care in the last stretch of his life, said things to each other at his hospital bedside that neither of us ever walked back, and I always told myself there'd be time to fix it eventually. There wasn't. Loretta never married, never had kids of her own, and she'd spent 3 decades quietly running our father's old trucking outfit, Bricknell Freight Lines, growing it from 6 trucks into a regional operation with contracts across 4 states. Thomas Ledoux told me that since Loretta had no children and our parents were both long gone, I was the sole surviving heir to everything she'd built: the company, the equipment, the real estate holdings, the business owned, all of it, once probate cleared. He put the estimated value somewhere north of $40 million. I sat in that garage apartment for a long while after that call ended, just listening to the refrigerator hum, not thinking about the money yet at all. I was thinking about a sister I'd lost twice, once to a fight neither of us ever fixed, and now permanently. I didn't walk up to the main house and tell Dennis and Priscilla. I didn't tell anyone at all. I just sat there grieving a woman I hadn't spoken to in 2 decades, trying to make sense of what any of it actually meant for a man my age. Over the following months, I handled everything quietly on the side, using the library computer downtown some afternoons, so nobody at the house would start asking questions about what I was doing. I hired an estate attorney in Wichita named Carol Van Tassel, sharp and no-nonsense, recommended to me by Frank, and she helped me set up a trust to hold everything Loretta had left behind, entirely separate from my day-to-day life in that garage apartment. I didn't change one thing about how I lived under Dennis's roof. I still handed over my $300 every month. I still drove Cole and Ruth Ann to school at 7:15. I still slept under the same quilt Diane had stitched years before in that little apartment above the garage. Part of that was grief, plain and simple. Not being ready to think about spending a dead sister's money on myself just yet. But part of it, if I'm honest with myself, was that I wanted to see exactly how my own son and his wife treated me, while they still believed I had nothing in the world but my pension and whatever was left in my savings account. While I was going through paperwork with Carol one afternoon at her office, something stopped me flat. Bricknell Freight Lines had a regional dispatch office right there in Wichita, and one of the terminal managers listed on the payroll was Dennis Bricknell, my own son. He'd worked there for almost 5 years, and he had no idea that the company signing his paychecks now belonged, through a trust, to me. Carol explained the ownership was structured privately enough that nobody at that Wichita terminal would ever connect a retired, long-haul trucker living over his son's garage to the name now sitting quietly atop the ownership. Documents. I didn't say a word to Dennis about any of it. I just carried that piece of information around folded up inside myself and kept living my same plain life in that apartment, waiting to see how things would unfold. As that spring rolled into summer, the comments around the house got less like jokes and more like decisions somebody had already made without me. Dennis started saying, in that tone people use when they're only half joking, that the garage apartment would make a fine home office once I didn't need it anymore, usually while scrolling real estate listings on his phone at breakfast. Priscilla mentioned more than once at dinner that her friend Beatrice had just moved her own father-in-law into an assisted living place down near Tulsa, and how much calmer their house felt afterward, how much space they suddenly had for themselves. She said it casually, like small talk, but she said it 3 different times inside of 1 month, and I wasn't imagining that pattern anymore by the third time. Other small things shifted too. My mail started sitting on the kitchen counter instead of getting brought out to me the way Ruth Ann always used to do it. My dinner plate got a little lighter on the nights I came in late from picking up a prescription downtown. Nobody invited me to Friday movie night in the living room anymore, not even Ruth Ann, though I doubted that decision had ever really been hers to make. Dennis started leaving real estate flyers folded open on the counter some mornings, listings for one-bedroom condos circled in blue pen. And I never once asked who those condos were meant for, because by then, I had a fairly good idea. My 67th birthday was coming that August, and Dennis told me Priscilla was planning something at the house, inviting the neighbors over, maybe some people from his church. I wanted to believe that meant something good. Some part of me, the part still missing Diane and still missing being anybody's priority, chose to believe it anyway, even with everything I'd already quietly noticed and said nothing about for months. By the time August came around, I'd finished everything with Carol Van Tassel. The trust was fully in place. The ownership of Bricknell Freight Lines was settled under my name, and I had somewhere north of $40 million sitting quietly behind me without a single soul in that house having any idea it existed. I felt something close to steady about all of it. Whatever happened next, I had grieved my sister in my own way, handled her business the way our father would have respected, even if she and I never got the chance to make things right face to face. And I'd kept living the exact same plain life in that garage apartment the whole time. Priscilla seemed genuinely wound up with excitement that week, running errands for decorations, ordering a sheet cake from the bakery on Rock Road that Diane always used to say was the only decent one in town. Dennis's parents on Priscilla's side were driving in from Amarillo that Friday. A dozen neighbors from up and down the street got invited, along with a couple of people from Dennis's church group. Ruth Ann helped me pick streamers at the party store, holding colors up and asking which ones Grandma Diane would have picked, and that small thing alone kept my spirits lifted the whole week leading into it. I helped set up folding tables in the backyard that Saturday afternoon, feeling something close to hope for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit, thinking maybe this really was them finally remembering I was still their father, still part of this family, and not just a line item somebody tallied up every month. I put on my good gray shirt that evening, the one Diane always said matched my eyes just right, combed what hair I had left, and walked out into that backyard ready to turn 67, surrounded by people I loved. The party ran fine through the first hour. Folks ate cake off paper plates under the string lights Dennis had put up the week before. Priscilla's father told the same story about a fishing trip to Canada that he tells every single time I've ever been within earshot of him. Then Dennis stood up near the patio with a folded piece of paper in his hand, and the yard went quiet, waiting on him. He said he had something to say, something he and Priscilla had talked through carefully, and his voice had that rehearsed steadiness to it, the kind a man uses when he's practiced saying something difficult in front of a mirror. He said it was time for me to think about my own independence, that they loved me, but they'd found a place, a senior community out near Broken Arrow, and he unfolded the paper to show me a brochure printed right there in color, a glossy photograph of strangers playing cards under fluorescent lights on the front of it. He said they'd already put down a deposit. Priscilla stood there, nodding along beside him, arms crossed, not quite meeting my eyes. A few of the neighbors shifted in their lawn chairs. Nobody said one word on my behalf, not even Priscilla's mother, who at least had the decency to stare hard at her plate instead of at me. I looked down at that brochure for a long moment, feeling the glossy paper between my fingers, same as I used to feel a bill of lading after a long haul. I didn't argue with him. I didn't raise my voice in front of all those people. I folded the brochure along its own crease, thanked Dennis for thinking ahead on my behalf, and told the yard the cake was excellent. Then I walked down to the garage apartment, sat on the edge of my recliner, and stared at that folded brochure for a long while, thinking about Diane, thinking about Loretta, thinking about $40 million sitting quiet in a trust that nobody standing out in that backyard tonight had the faintest idea existed. I didn't say goodbye to anybody that night. Once the last car pulled out of the driveway and the house went dark, I packed one duffel bag with a few changes of clothes and the folder Carol had given me, and I walked out past the garage around midnight without switching on a single light. I didn't slam any doors. I didn't leave a note taped to the refrigerator. I just left the same quiet way I'd been living in that apartment for 3 years, except this time, I knew standing in that driveway I wasn't coming back to it. I checked into a Hampton Inn off the turnpike and sat on the edge of the bed with that folded brochure still in my shirt pocket. I called Frank Delacroix a little after midnight, woke him clean out of sleep, and told him everything that had happened in that backyard, right down to the brochure and the way Priscilla wouldn't meet my eyes. Frank went quiet on the line a moment after I finished. Then he reminded me of something buried in that note we'd drawn up years before for the $160,000, a clause saying the debt would forgive itself at $16,000 a year, but only for as long as I was living in that house and being treated as family in good faith. Otherwise, the full remaining balance came due on 30 days' notice. I sat with that a long while that night, looking out the window at the highway lights running past. I wasn't angry the way people usually picture anger. I was just finished being surprised by things I should have seen shaping up for a year already. The next morning, over hotel coffee that tasted like nothing at all, I called Carol first and told her I was ready to step fully into everything Loretta had left me. No more waiting on it. Then I called Frank and had him draw up the paperwork on that note. There was still $96,000 left owing on it, and I told him to send a formal demand letter calling the full balance due inside 30 days, exactly the way the note allowed under its own terms. Frank asked if I wanted to sit with it a few more days before he filed anything. I told him I'd already sat with it for 3 years. and one glossy brochure in a backyard had made the actual decision for me the night before. This wasn't about hurting my own son for the sake of hurting him. It was about a piece of paper he and Priscilla signed years back, with clear conditions written into it, conditions nobody in that house was honoring anymore. I also learned from Carol that Bricknell Freight Lines had already been planning, long before Loretta ever passed, to consolidate its smaller regional terminals, folding the Wichita dispatch office into a larger hub down in Oklahoma City to cut overhead. It had nothing to do with me, and nothing to do with Dennis personally. Just a business decision the old board had been chewing over in quarterly meetings for a year before Loretta's name and mine ever got attached to any of it. I decided that morning I wouldn't step in to stop that consolidation, and I wouldn't step in to save Dennis's job either. I wasn't going to use my new position to hurt him deliberately, pulling levers just to watch him struggle. I simply wasn't going to use it to protect him anymore. Not after that brochure. Not after watching Priscilla stand there nodding along in front of the whole street. Exactly 1 week after my birthday, a process server knocked on the door at Dennis and Priscilla's house at 10 in the morning and handed Priscilla a certified letter demanding repayment of $96,000 inside 30 days. My phone started buzzing on the hotel nightstand. Within the hour, call after call. I let the first several go to voicemail while I finished my coffee downstairs, watching cars move along the frontage road outside. When I finally answered, Dennis's voice was shaking, asking what this letter even meant, saying there had to be some mix-up, that lawyers don't just show up at a man's front door like that. I told him calmly there was no mix-up, that Frank had drawn up that note years back, exactly the way he and Priscilla had signed it, with conditions built right into it about how I was treated while living under their roof. I told him those terms hadn't been honored, so the balance was simply due, plain as that. Nothing personal in the timing of it at all. He asked how I could do this to my own son after everything I'd handed them over the years. I reminded him, gentle but clear, that everything I'd handed them had come with a signed piece of paper attached, drawn up by a real attorney, sitting in a filing cabinet for years, waiting to matter someday. He went quiet on the line, and I could hear Priscilla's voice somewhere behind him, muffled, asking who he was talking to. I told him I loved him, and meant every word of it. But that loving somebody doesn't mean letting them hand you a brochure for a nursing home in front of the whole street and expecting not one thing to change afterward. Then I told him I had somewhere to be, said I'd talk to him soon, and hung up gentle, sitting there a minute after just listening to the quiet of that hotel room. 2 weeks after that letter landed, the restructuring at Bricknell Freight Lines moved forward exactly the way the old board had already mapped it out months before. The Wichita terminal folded into Oklahoma City, and Dennis's position as terminal manager got eliminated along with 6 others in a standard company-wide reduction announced inside a 15-minute meeting on a Friday. Dennis had no idea then, and still doesn't fully know now, that his own father had become the majority owner of the very company that just let him go. He came home that Friday and told Priscilla he'd lost his job, 5 years of steady work gone quicker than a lunch break. Between that news and a $96,000 demand letter sitting on their kitchen counter, the pressure in that house became something they couldn't quietly step around anymore. Something that showed up plain in Dennis's voice every time he called me that weekend. He called twice that Saturday, and I let both go to voicemail, not out of spite, but because I honestly didn't know yet what to say to him, and I wasn't going to pretend I did. Frank told me later they'd gone to their bank about refinancing to cover the note, but with Dennis suddenly out of work and nothing lined up, no bank wanted to extend them fresh credit. The house I'd helped them buy in the first place was now the only real asset standing between them and that debt, and everybody in that house understood it by then. Dennis apparently spent that whole week mailing out resumes at the same kitchen table where he'd once left condo listings circled in blue pen. Frank said the mood in that house shifted from confusion into something closer to real panic once both problems landed the same week. About 3 weeks after the party, Priscilla showed up at my hotel unannounced on a Tuesday evening, standing in the lobby, looking like she hadn't slept right in days, her coat buttoned crooked. She apologized, actually apologized, said the whole brochure idea had been more Dennis's doing than hers, that she'd gone along with it because she was stretched thin and exhausted and just wanted her garage back for storage. She asked if there was any way I'd forgive the loan, or at least stretch the deadline further, now that Dennis had nothing to fall back on. I let her get every word out, without cutting in. When she finished, I told her I appreciated her making the drive out to say it, and I meant that. But I told her the truth, too, that for 3 years I'd felt more like a boarder paying rent than a father living under his own son's roof. And that brochure in the backyard had only confirmed what I'd already started suspecting for months before it ever happened. I told her I wasn't out to punish anybody, but I also wasn't going to pretend the debt didn't exist just because things had gotten hard for them all of a sudden. Through Frank, I agreed to give them an extra 30 days on the deadline, nothing beyond that. I didn't forgive $1 of it. I didn't make a single call to anybody at Bricknell Freight Lines trying to get Dennis his old job back. I told Priscilla that some things a person has to work through on his own, the same way I'd had to work through my own life alone in a hotel room at 67 years old, with nobody checking whether I was all right. By early fall, I'd bought myself a modest two-bedroom house in a quiet part of East Wichita. Paid in cash, nothing fancy, just solid, with a covered porch that caught good evening light. I reconnected with a few old drivers I used to run routes with, fellows I hadn't sat down with in years, and we started meeting most Wednesday mornings at a diner off Kellogg Avenue, trading old road stories the way we used to before life got complicated. It felt good being somewhere I wasn't handing over rent money just to keep a seat at somebody's table. I also went back to Carol Van Tassel and set up a separate trust, funded straight through for Cole and Ruth Ann, money that would go directly toward their college tuition down the road, entirely outside anything Dennis or Priscilla could ever touch or manage themselves. I wanted my grandkids taken care of properly. I just didn't want that care running through hands that had shown me plainly what they were willing to do the moment things turned inconvenient for them. One evening in late October, my phone rang, and it was Ruth Ann calling off Priscilla's cell, her voice quick and bright the way 7-year-olds talk when they're excited about something. She just wanted to tell me about a diorama she'd built for school, a whole solar system made out of styrofoam balls, not asking me for anything, not knowing one thing about lawyers or demand letters or her father losing his job. She just missed her grandpa and wanted to talk about Saturn's rings for 20 straight minutes. I sat out on my new porch listening to her go on, and for the first time since that backyard, something in my chest loosened just a touch, remembering that not everybody in that family had looked at me the way Dennis and Priscilla had that August. The house went on the market that November. Dennis and Priscilla couldn't refinance it and couldn't scrape together the note any other way. So they sold it, paid off what they owed me in full, and moved into a smaller rental closer to the lower-paying dispatch job. Dennis eventually landed at a smaller trucking outfit across town. I didn't gloat over any part of it. I didn't call around asking how the sale went or how the new place looked. Frank handled the last of the paperwork quiet and clean, and that closed out that particular chapter between my son and me. Dennis and I talk now every couple of weeks. Careful conversations over the phone, nothing like what we used to have back when Diane was alive, keeping the whole family close around her table. But something honest at least, something real. He's never once brought up that brochure or broken arrow again, and I've never raised it either, and I don't plan to. I still see Cole and Ruth Ann regular now, on my own terms, picking them up some Sundays for dinner at the diner off Kellogg Avenue. And Ruth Ann still calls just to talk about her day, not because she needs one single thing from me. I sit out on my porch most evenings now, in the house I bought with my sister's money and my own hard-earned peace of mind, watching the light shift over the elm trees across the street. And I think about how strange it is that losing Loretta, a sister I hadn't spoken to in 20 years, ended up teaching me more about who genuinely wanted me around than 3 years of living under my own son's roof ever managed to. I'm not bitter about how any of it turned out, and I don't spend my evenings running that backyard back through my head looking for something new to be angry about. I'm just finally, for the first time in longer than I can properly remember, exactly where I want to be.